Well, good afternoon. Glad to have you in Psalm study today. We're going to be looking at Psalm 55. And uh, Psalm 55 is rather long, so we are going to break it up into several parts. It's just a little too long to try to bite off in one sitting. So we'll be looking at Psalm 55 over probably the next 3 weeks, I'm guessing. And that will probably take us all the way up till Christmas. Psalm 55 is an individual lament. Remember, just as a refresher again, a lament psalm is a device, a structure for poetry to move possibly the author, but more likely the listener, from a place of sadness and despair to a place of trust and faith in God that He will deliver on His promises like He has of old. We begin with Psalm 55. It is a maskil of David, meaning it's a psalm or it's a writing of David. We can attribute it to an author. And it starts off with how we would expect a summons to Yahweh, and we get right away in verse 1. Ha'azina Elohim tepelati ve'al titalam miteninati. I think it's, the stress is there. Give ear, O God, to my prayer. The prayer here is the word for tefillah. It comes from palal, which is a prayer. Pretty straightforward word for prayer there. Give ear to my prayer, and do not hide yourself from my supplication. Give ear to my prayer, do not hide yourself from my plea for mercy. Okay, let's take a look at this word here. Tekina, which is favor, supplication, mercy, petition. So hide yourself not from my plea for mercy, my supplication. Now, what would lead David to start here? I think the answer is it's fairly obvious, but we should start from the beginning. The idea here is that David doesn't feel as though he doesn't feel as though his prayers are being heard, and he feels as though God is hidden from him. God won't necessarily deliver on all the things that he is looking for, that he wants, because he just doesn't seem to be there. David's crying out for various things for God to do and to provide, and it's not happening. Verse 2. Hakisiba li va'aneni arid besehi va'ahima. Attend to me, and ani, answer me, hear me. I am restless in my complaint, and I moan noisily. So the complaint, I think, would refer back to, well, actually, I don't think we've learned what the complaint is going to be. Yeah. The complaint is actually verse 3, or at least it's the beginning of the complaint, the problem the problem proper that David is upset about, right? But um he's asking God to listen and to hear because of what's going on in verse 3, and because he has this issue that isn't being dealt with, this problem. A lot of times David will write um that he is dismayed, not even on a personal level, but he's upset that the enemies of God are making a mockery of God, right? So he's almost like upset for God's sake. Like maybe it's happened to me before. Like something's happened, and my parents or my children, my wife are more upset for me than I am upset, right? Um, I think that's kind of what's going on here is that David is at times upset that the people of the Lord are almost flaunting the fact that they're disobeying the God of the Hebrews, and that the Catholics they're talking about how their God is greater, boasting about that in front of God's people. They're laughing at the state of God's people and how they're oppressed by their enemies, things like this. Um, so it bothers David. Here, I think we can take it to mean that whatever this complaint is, it is making him not sleep, right? It's making him groan or moan noisily. And I don't know if this word moan here has a sense of like screaming, right? Like, okay, so to murmur, to roar, defeat in battle. So I think we can kind of understand, like maybe not moaning, but I think we can understand being upset enough where we just inside we just want to scream, just want to yell, right? You get so angry and so that this whatever this is, this anxiety, this anger, this whatever emotion, it just has this need to come out. A lot of times it comes out in the sense of screaming, yelling, excuse me, being angry, all these kinds of things. So God's seeming inattention to this problem that's bothering David is causing David no fair amount of anxiety and distress. Okay. So on those terms, then, I think we understand the the ways in which evil triumphs at times, what it looks like in the world, right? Looks like evil is doing evil things in the world. Um, there's a lack of justice at the highest levels of justice in our land, and especially in other countries as well, right? People are oppressed, especially in places like China and Korea, North Korea, and uh, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, places like this, right? There's active persecution, there's lack of justice. Women are treated terribly. Afghanistan, bad stuff's happening all over the place, and it can seem as though evil is going unchecked. And it seems as though the regular citizen, like you or me, there's just very little we can do to affect change, which is very frustrating. And it can make you just scream. I think this is kind of similar to what's going on here. David is banging his head against a problem he really has very little control over. So, number 3, uh, Mikaol Oyeb Mipene Akat Rasa Ki Yamitu Ale Aven Ube Ubeap. Because Cole would be voice, right? So because of the voice, so the first word is McCole. Cole would be voice of the enemy. Uh, because of the oppression of the wicked, for they bring down trouble They bring down upon me trouble and wrath. Is that how it's translated here? I'm just looking at the Hebrew here. Because of the oppression of the wicked. That's pretty straightforward. For they drop trouble upon me. Okay, so yeah, they drop down trouble, and in wrath they hate me. Yeah. So they bear a grudge against me. Let's look at that the hate me word here. Let's see why they're translating hate here. It's bear a grudge, cherish animosity against. I hate probably is the right word. Persecute, right? Harassed. So, for they bring down upon me trouble. Let's look at this trouble word. That's interesting. Sorrow, wickedness, trouble. Okay. They bring down upon me trouble, and in wrath they hate me. So, wrath would be yeah. I wonder, in the sense of like someone's maybe made up their mind, far decided that they don't like you. So this idea of like they're angry and they're kind of vengeful towards you already. So in wrath, in this situation, they hate me. They just do what comes natural. They hate. They want to be rid of me. Now let's analyze what David could possibly be talking about. Right? He puts it the voice of the enemy. The enemy. It's not. It's we could have gotten my enemy, but it's the enemy. Which see the problem is that David is a crowned king. David's been anointed by God to be king. So David's enemies are God's enemies, and God's enemies are David's. See what I'm saying is that for the most part, except when you get to like Uriah the Hittite, the people who oppose David oppose God's rule in Israel. God has chosen David to be king. However, this works itself out is God's plan. But if you side with Saul, you've made the wrong choice, right? So that makes you an enemy of God because God has anointed David to be king instead of Saul. So the enemies, he says the enemy. I think that almost refers to he's like the enemy. It's not just my enemy, it's the enemy, right? So if the enemies are opposed to me, they're opposed to God. So this could be any group of people, Saul and his, there would have been a coterie of people along with Saul, right? Nobles, leaders, royal staff inside the royal residence. So you're talking a fairly large group of people, not just Saul and his family. Like there's been a pretty large people. In fact, from the scriptures, I get the sense that the number of people at the beginning, David's anointed king by Samuel. So of course Samuel supports David, but it seems like the overall majority of the people in the kingdom, at the beginning at least, support Saul until later on, when David proves himself to be the true king. So I think there's that one point where I think David is bringing the Ark of the Covenant back, and he's dancing and letting an ephod. I think one of Saul's daughters. Saul's already dead at this point. But one of Saul's daughters kind of hurls insults at David, and of course she ends up things go poorly for her. But the point being is that there are probably lots of people hurling insults at David at the beginning of his reign, during when Saul's still alive, even after Saul's dead, they're still doing it. The oppression of the wicked. I mean, Saul is harassing David, right? He's chasing him from place to place. He's got him under persecution. It's not surprising that David would use this language, the oppression, right? They bring down trouble upon me. Yeah, they're consistently attacking him, surrounding him. He has to make his way through traps and through groups of people several times. and the hate is pretty straightforward. So of course these we're locking these into maybe historical they don't have to be. They don't have to be historical context. David could be reflecting on these things and using them perhaps as fodder to think about just general life in the world. God's enemies are legion, and they will always be, um, you know, talking, for lack of a better word, talking smack. God's enemies will be um, speaking out against him. There will always be people of oppression and wickedness, right? So that hasn't changed. I mean, that's the case now. Okay. And then we could even look at the two major events in David's life that we could look at in terms of oppression. David he also has kind of a low point where he's battling, I think, the Philistines, and they kind of get the better hand for a while. So it could be that as well. But you have like basically the time where David's only the king and Saul's still king. That's a hard time for David. And then when Absalom, his son, takes over his throne for a while, that's also a time where some of these psalms are written, these lament psalms. Which one is this? Or is it during the time where he's battling the Philistines? Or is David thinking prophetically and he's talking about, you know, I mean, think about it. Any psalm that David writes, really any psalm that's written, you can take the author out and then replace it with Jesus and let him say the words, and it has a whole new meaning, but it's just as godly and just as biblical, right? So imagine if Christ is reading verse 3 because of the voice of the enemy, because the oppression, he's like, listen to my complaint, hear me, because I'm restless. You know, Jesus is routinely going up against Pharisees and Sadducees and scribes and elected leaders who don't like him and they want to get rid of him. They don't like the things that he has to say and the people that he offends, right? So you could go that way too. That of course, it doesn't quite work because Jesus would understand why God is doing what he's doing, right? So David is quite literally at the beginning wondering, God, what are you doing? Why aren't you doing what I want you to do? Whereas Jesus would not have any kind of inclination in that respect. He would know why God is doing what he's doing, and he would never question God's plan. Even at the very end, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, your will be done. So we get into verse 4 then. Levi, Yachiel, is that Yachiel, Bekari, Ve'emot, Mavet, Napelu, Ale. Lave is for heart, and the e at the end is the pronoun my, right? So my heart, Yachiel, is severely pained. Bekari, I think karav is the root word here. Yeah, kareb, inward part, the midst of me. I wonder if you couldn't make a connection with the Greek Greek word splonxizomai, because that's like in the inner parts as well. Just the Greek version of it. Inward part of man. That's one of the definitions down here. The center, whether literal, figurative, or adverbial, right? Among, before, bowels. Yeah, so it definitely would be, I think, a connection to splonxizomai. So there are some places where Christ has feeling down in his guts for people. He has like this deep concern for them in his innermost parts. So anyway, my heart is severely. David's still complaining. My heart is severely pained within me. And the terrors, mavet would be death. The terrors of death, nepalu, nefal, I think it's to fall. So have fallen upon me. Actually, pretty straightforward voice. Very, very straightforward verse. Excuse me. Very straightforward meaning, right? With what's happened before, right? It seems as though the voice of the enemy can talk whatever kind of things it wants to say. Oppression's happening, wrath and troubles falling down upon me. And because, it's not just because of the stuff that's going on. It's because all this stuff is going on and it doesn't seem like God is answering, right? In the midst of his troubles and his sorrows and his grief, he also feels like God is being silent and not responding to his cries. So it's kind of a double whammy. And so forth, then, my heart is severely pained, and the terrors of death have fallen upon me. Verse 5. Yira vara'ad yabo bi vatekaseni palasut. Fearfulness, Yirad is to tremble. Yira is to fear, I think. Let's look at that. I always thought Yirad was to fear, but I guess I'm wrong there. A fear. No. Let's look at Yirad then. That was Yira. Then Yirad. Trembling. That's an interesting, you miss it because of the Vav, but literally it says it's Yira, Yirad. Yira, Yirad. Yira, Yarad, right? I mean, there's a Vav in there, but it's like there's almost a bit of like rhyming going on there. So Yira, Yarad, Yava. That's interesting, huh? Have come. It would have been so have come upon me, and horror has overwhelmed me. What's the word for horror here? That's interesting. A shuddering. Horror. So like shuddering to such extent that shuddering to a great extent because something's very awful, right? So it follows a pretty typical Hebrew pattern where the first phrase is, fearfulness, trembling have come. So it's trembling, and then have come upon me, and then it goes even more, kind of dives even further deeper, but it makes the first thing kind of even more strong as it relates back to, right? Horror has overwhelmed me, right? And the horror has a kind of a similar meaning in terms of trembling, and then horror, the shuddering of great horror because of horror, right? So he's afraid, he's trembling, he feels overwhelmed, right? The situation around him is bad. Verse 6. The Omar mi yeten li eber kayona upa ve'es kona. So Amar is to say, so I said, oh, that I had two wings like a dove. Now, two, not as in the number two, but two as in towards, right? Oh, that I had, I don't think we would translate the two, the Hebrew does, but I think we would just say, oh, that I had wings like a dove. Yeah. I would fly away and be at rest. Pretty straightforward. There's not a lot of interesting things here. So let's look at this word for rest. Just shakan is the root word. It means to settle down, to abide, to dwell. So maybe almost in the sense of I would fly away and build a nest and be at rest. Find a place to abide and be safe. I think this is kind of a sentiment today. The Benedict option was a book put out not too long ago, and this idea that we can kind of go somewhere. I mean, it's happening a lot, where a lot of people leaving like California, leaving New York, leaving certain states to go to other states, and they're leaving to get away from, crime issues or whatever the case may be. Why they're leaving, it's not to, I don't want to talk a lot about why. Just the point is, it is happening. People are leaving from one place to another, And so we're doing this a lot where when our problems come, our first answer is to go somewhere else and to get away from them, not to plant myself in the ground and say, no, we're going to fix these problems. And I think we go back to, like verse 3, where the reason why we might run is because it seems like the voice of the enemy is there's no pushback. There's no forces. So it feels like God's absent. He's not doing anything. Where is God? He doesn't seem to be here. And so there doesn't seem to be anything pushing back against the evil of our time, or of David's time, right? It's just enemies of God can say whatever they want to say. They can be whoever they want to be. They can do whatever they want to do. Wickedness and wrath, it doesn't go punished. What's going on here? And so, because it doesn't seem like there's any kind of solution, David wishes to fly away. Now, this is not necessarily to David's. Is not a compliment towards David, because he has a job. He has a vocation as the king of Israel. A very important job. It's not his to be a dove and to fly away. It's his to rule. That's his vocation. That's what God has appointed him to do. And very much like the rest of us, right? We may very much wish, in the face of anxiety and distress and the terrors and the problems in the world, to run away from them. But that is not what we've been called to do. We've been called to live out our vocation, do what God has given us to do. You know? Verse 7. Hineh, Arhik, Nedod, Alin, Bamidbar, Salah. So Midbar is, or what is it? Dabar is actually desert. So Midbar is the letters in front are prefixes. Hineh, is always kind of like, behold, look up, pay attention, right? Far off would I wander and remain in the wilderness. Salah. Salah is kind of like a closing of the sentence there. So it's interesting. You got to wonder who the Hineh is for, right? If Hineh is literally like, listen up, behold, well, who is David talking to? And I can't help but think that he's talking to God. It's like, hey, if things don't get better, I'm going to go into the wilderness. And because David's a capable guy, right? He's a soldier. He's got strengths. He's been a shepherd. He can take care of himself out in the wilderness. Going out in the wilderness is going to be like old hat to him. And he can finally be free of all the warfare and subterfuge and temple or royal politics and all this other kind of garbage, right? It probably would be a much more pleasing, satisfying life for him than what he's currently going through. Hey, behold, I can wander way out there and remain in the wilderness. And I have to imagine, like, it's probably the same thought that Jonah had. Like, I can go away from, I can go towards Tarshish, away from the place I'm supposed to go, right? And it'll all work out for me. Because if I go towards Tarshish, well, God won't be able to see me there. He won't be able to tell me what to do there. Well, no. God's going to find you, and he's going to tell you what to do, and he's going to make you do it whether you like it or not. So I think that's just a good. David's tired. He's sick of the brokenness of the world and the brokenness of his kingdom around him, and what God's asked him to do is seemingly impossible. And to be honest with you, that is not a bad place to stop. I know I said to 11, but since the Salah is right there after verse 8, I think that's a good place to stop for today. So we'll leave it there. You'll notice that the Salah comes up to verse 7. Verse 8 begins a new thought, and we get into verse 9, and we're going to get into the request that David has for God. Well, why don't we just do? Well, I don't know. Where do we have another? Do we have a Salah in there? Yeah, not until verse 19. That's a long ways. No, we'll stick with that. Well, that's a big chunk to do in one time, though. Is it? Yeah. Let's stop there for today. Well, the Lord's blessings on your day. We look forward to seeing you next time. God's peace.